Wszystko zaczęło się od króla Jagiełły. Mała Łodzia stała się miastem, które w XIX wieku rozwijało się najszybciej na świecie. W ciągu zaledwie 60 lat od powstania pierwszej manufaktury powstaje przemysłowa, wielonarodowościowa metropolia. Jednak wiatry historii nie zawsze jej sprzyjały. To, co zniszczył los, odbudowują łodzianie. Nasza Łódź. Miasto wielkich szans. Od 600 lat w sercu Polski i Europy.
Jesteśmy Polakami. Jesteśmy niezwykłym społeczeństwem. Zawsze w obliczu wielkiego wyzwania potrafimy się mobilizować. Potrafimy stawić czoła wielkim wyzwaniom. Bo nie potrafimy stać obojętnie. Bo obchodzi nas bezpieczeństwo i przyszłość naszych dzieci. Bo wierzymy, że nadzieja zwycięża apatię, lęk i strach. Bo mimo wszelkich przeciwności nigdy się nie poddajemy. Potrafimy ciężko pracować, wspierać się i działać razem. Bo zależy nam na naszej ojczyźnie, naszym osiedlu, naszej ulicy. Bo chcemy naszych niezbywalnych praw i wolności. Bo nie oddamy naszych marzeń. Nadchodzi punkt zwrotny.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our today's panel on geopolitics. My name is Katarzyna Pisarska, and I am the chair of the Council of the Kazimierz Pulaski Foundation and the chair of the Warsaw Security Forum. And I wanted to welcome first and foremost our panel, our wonderful speakers coming from a variety of different European countries. I'll start with Gerlinde Niehus, who's here representing NATO. Welcome, Gerlinde. It's great to have you. But also Georg Sørensen, who is an expert on security, joining us as well here in Łódź. And finally, our Hungarian friend, István Szent-Iványi, coming also in the area of security we're going to talk today. Welcome, Ivan. Great to have you here. Of course, we are missing one more panelist, Jacek Bartosiak. Jacek is on his way here. There was a big traffic accident, and unfortunately, he will arrive at the end of the panel. So, but knowing that many of you have come here specifically to listen to you, what I have agreed with the organizers is that we're going to move with the panel that is 45 minutes to kind of discuss all the more important issues of today's European security architecture. And Jacek will join us for a one-on-one conversation at 6:45. We'll have a quick 15-minute discussion that we're also going to bring all the topics we're going to discuss here with you in this 45 minutes. So we're trying to do the best of this situation, and I'm sure that it's going to be a fascinating discussion as we start. And of course, an important element is also your contribution to our today's discussion. So my big request is don't shy away from asking questions to our panelists. We'll do a kind of 15-20 minute starting discussion between us, and then I'm going to open the floor to all of you here. So we're going to start actually with you, Gerlinde, and if we could ask you to kind of set the stage for us. We are at the moment in a truly historical time where European security architecture has been shaken to the core by the Russian invasion of Ukraine last year. And I think everything we've believed, everything we held as true, today is in a way questioned by autocrats. So if you could set the stage for us also from the perspective of NATO as a whole and Europe as an alliance.
Yeah, thank you so much. Now it works, yeah. Thank you so much, Katarzyna. Really great to be back in Poland. Thanks for having me. Poland for me is always the country of, to name just a few, I mean, Nicolaus Copernicus, Marie Curie, Frédéric Chopin. Since we are in Lodz, I probably should also add Roman Polanski. So big cultural and scientific achievements, but also for me, it's really also the country who shook off communist dictatorship and had a peaceful transition to a democracy. So in that sense, I think there's also this historic achievement of Poland to have contributed to making Europe whole, free, and at peace. Now zooming forward to today, clearly we are in a Europe which is not at peace. So, and indeed, I think the Russians, President Putin's all-out war of aggression against Ukraine has shattered peace and security in Europe. But at the same time, I think we should, and we certainly will talk more about that, we should not forget the other challenges to our security. You refer to, I mean, we have the rising competition between democracy and authoritarian states. We have the I quote, the partnership without limits between China and Russia, who are challenging the international rules-based order, who try to sow instability and pose and bad governments or challenge good governance in Africa, but also closer to us in the Western Balkans. So there are many challenges there: terrorism, climate change, increasing cyber attacks, to mention just a few. And then sort of also in perspective, and I guess the colleague here to my right, Professor Sørensen, will dwell more on that. I think there are also then broader trends such as increased fragmentation of our societies in spite of the ever more connected societies we have. Probably also more resource scarcity, which we will be facing as we move along. And then perhaps a bit more on the positive side of the spectrum, more power to non-state actors, which of course also for institutions such as NATO entails to think hard, what does it actually mean if we have many actors which are non-state actors gaining prevalence. So I think this is in very short terms the scenario as it unfolds. From the NATO side, I think we have made a big strategic shift in the last years. You can see this more in detail if you look into our strategic concept. The last one was adopted in the summit in Madrid last year. And just a snapshot, the comparison there. I mean, the last one was from 2010. We described the Euro-Atlantic area to be at peace. The now strategic concept, of course, says exactly the opposite. The Euro-Atlantic area is not at peace, and Russia is its biggest threat. So then Russia, again, the biggest threat. We used to look at Russia as a strategic partner. Yeah? And for China, just to give another example, in the strategic concept from 2010, there was not a single word about China. And now we have China there, where we say we are observing the ambitions and the coercive stance of China, which are a concern to us. So I think it's fair to say that NATO has dramatically changed its strategic outlook. But perhaps more important, or equally important, is that we have also changed the way we are working as an alliance. And again, only very briefly, three areas to mention. The most prevalent probably is the intensified defense and deterrence posture. That is something which already started with the illegal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, but clearly since February 2022, there has been a further uplift in defense and deterrence. And you see this very clearly when you look at the defense posture we have, because I mean there are planes in the air on the eastern side of the alliance on an hourly basis every day. Their ships at sea. We are doing intense monitoring of what goes on. But we are also, how should I put it? I mean, we have increased the number of battle groups in the east from 4 to 8. We are exercising to scale these up from battalion, which is up to 1,000 forces per group, to a brigade size, which is up to 5,000. So there's a lot of reinforcement in defense and deterrence, which has been going on and will continue. And that, of course, costs also more money. And for that, since the Vilnius summit, which was earlier this year, we have a binding commitment from all allies to invest at least 2% of GDP in defense. In parentheses, Poland here is a real role model because Poland is aiming at 4%. So, but for the alliance as a whole, I think we need to go to where we were actually at the end of the Cold War, where all allies were able to invest 2%. So I think that's where we need to go back to. And then also when it comes to doing things concretely, I mean, enlargement. President Putin wanted to stop it. He got just the opposite. So we already have Finland in there as a new member, Sweden to join very, very soon. And with that, the entire calculus, the entire strategy for the Arctic and the Baltic will change significantly in the favor of NATO and to the detriment of President Putin. A few remarks on NATO-EU. In many ways, in this context, and I'm not going to go into the details at this stage, in many ways, in this context, the NATO-EU partnership is more important than ever. We, from the NATO side, we do want a strong European defense. We want Europe to invest more in defense. We also want Europe to gain and to develop a geostrategic posture, which we think it can, provided it invests more in its defense. You cannot have strategic responsibility without, let's say, putting the money where your mouth is. It doesn't. You don't get it for free. Yeah? So we see favorably a strengthened European defense and defense capability in complementarity with NATO. And probably we can touch upon that in the discussion if there's an interest. Last word, I already mentioned China. From the NATO perspective, we do not consider China to be an adversary. We do see that there is scope for cooperation, for example, in areas such as climate change or arms control. Incidentally, the Chinese are building up their military capabilities in a complete opaque fashion. Yeah? And I think there was in an earlier panel somebody saying the Chinese military is weak. Well, I wish it were that way, so it would be better. But in fact, they are modernizing, mobilizing with immense intensity. They're building their nuclear arsenal with immense intensity. So we should not be naive of what is going on there. And but we should also not jump the gun and consider China to be an adversary, because, as I said, for the time being, we are observing its coercive position. So a lot is going on, and but in many ways, just to sum up, I think the better we synchronize and the more we stick together as EU, as NATO, as the US, if you wish, if you may say so, as the good guys on this planet, yeah, the better we'll be off. Because I think at the end of the day, it's a question of the survival of our open societies and our democracies.
Thank you very much. So moving on, I think we can all agree that the unity of the Transatlantic Alliance and the European Union around this crisis surprised even us. It surprised Putin, for sure. It surprised us even more. But what are the most important lessons learned, especially from a European point of view and from the European security point of view, that we draw from the Russian aggression against Ukraine? Professor.
Thank you very much. I wish I could answer that. If I should give you a really brief answer, I would say that depends. You're a lawyer. That depends on who wins the next American election. If it's Mr. Trump, we will see a very different situation from the present one. It also depends on what will happen in the Ukrainian-Russian war. At the present time, it looks like Russia will lose. But how long time will that take? And how much destruction of Ukraine will be in the cards? on that account. We don't know that yet. Are there other crises in the making, as you indicated, that have to do with economics, migration, climate? So, depending on these issues, we will find our answers. So, I think that today most of you will agree that the liberal democratic societies are on the defensive and under pressure. So let me briefly give you some good news. First, I don't think we are going to see a complete breakdown of trade and economic cooperation. Globalization will not come to a complete stop. China can't sell all their electrical cars to North Korea and Russia. They need the Western markets. So does Russia in the medium, longer run. In that sense, some measure of substantial economic cooperation will continue. Second, we are forced to closer cooperation because of climate change. And I think that has already become quite clear this summer, and it will become increasingly clear in the coming years. Third, and that's my last piece of good news, so listen carefully. No one, not even the most autocratic dictator you can think of, and there are a few out there, is interested in comprehensive nuclear war. These weapons are for political pressure, not for actual use. So, some substantial cooperation is in the cards, and the absence of comprehensive nuclear war. That's the good news. Now for the bad news. Liberals and liberal countries have their own problems. Liberals are in some basic sense always potential imperialists. Why? Because we believe our values are better than others and should apply to all. That is true, of course. But it also indicates that we know better than everyone else, and that we can impose on them, as we did in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, and elsewhere. My view is that, yes, our values are universal, but we need to rein in our tendency to imposition and imperial behavior. Also because bad guys, including Mr. Putin, might be inspired by that. So liberalism always is in a dilemma between doing too much in terms of spreading our values and telling others what is the right type of having your societies and your lives, and at the same time being pluralists. As Roosevelt said in 1941, everyone should be able to decide their own religion and what they want to think. So we are pluralists, but we are also potential imperialists with our universal values. And that is a problem that will remain with us. Second, liberal economic globalization has done a pile of good, but also a pile of bad. We see rampant inequality, with billions of poor and very few rich. We see accumulated climate problems, both in the West and elsewhere, against which we have done far too little. Third, and I'll finish soon, liberal democracy is not doing too well in many countries. There's populism turning inwards, refusing to confront pressing common problems. The EU has done fairly well during the Corona crisis and the Ukraine-Russia crisis, but there's still a lot to do, and the future is complicated. And finally, I want to emphasize that we must understand, and this concerns especially China and also Russia, of course, that economic modernization does not necessarily bring about democracy. It's an old liberal idea that all good things go together. But maybe they don't, or I don't think they do at all in many cases. And we have to revise our thinking there, as Frank Fukuyama has done in recent years. And now to your questions.
But you really have 30 seconds to answer to that, because we need to have a discussion as well as questions from the audience.
Well, I'll answer your questions later.
István, we heard, I think, a few wise words here, that the challenges that European security faces are truly multidimensional. So it's not only about the military threat, it's truly not only about even economic threats, but it is also the fragmentation of society. What are for you the lessons learned for Europe and European security as a consequence of the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine?
Thank you, Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen. Not easy to say anything after two excellent presentations, but I try to do so and try to be brief. I would like to make three remarks. My first remark, the folks will never be vegetarian. The authoritarian, undemocratic Russia will not be a peaceful, reliable partner anymore. Of course, a democratic Russia, a prosperous Russia could be a good partner, but I do not see it to come, at least not in the near future, on the horizon. Therefore, we have got some wake-up calls, and they did not take seriously. In 2007, that was a Putin speech at the Munich Security Conference. 2008, war in Georgia. 2014, war in Ukraine, annexation of Crimea and Donetsk, Luhansk. 2015 in Syria. And we did not believe in that what would have come. And really, we behaved like the sleepwalkers and lived in a dream world. Now, we should wake up. That's the first, and I see that in that sense the war was a good warning signal, and we understood. My second point is, which is important, we have to complete and add the vocabulary of the European Union. The European Union tends to, or so far, to consider every country as a friend, as a partner, and they did not know that the world is much more colorful. There are not only friends and partners. There are hostile countries, there are enemies, there are rivals, there are challengers. We should take aware of that, and we should conduct according to that. That's very important. It has been a bizarre alliance of the naive idealists and unprincipled opportunists in Europe. They have pretended to believe in that we can change those countries via or through economic engagement, through trade, commerce, investment. It did not happen. Russia disapproved this false hope and false illusion. Did not happen. Just the opposite has happened. We have become dependent and exposed to that, and they weaponized against us this dependency. The crude oil and gas, Russia, or CRM, the critical raw materials, China, and so on. We should learn from that lesson, and hope so that we will do that. But the task, I'm not against the trade with those countries, but I am against the false hope and false illusion to that, and we should de-risk the commerce and trade that, and concentrate to establish our economic autonomy as well. And my third and last point is that on the European strategic autonomy or sovereignty, as you wish and as you can call it. Of course, the best option for us is NATO. All security relies on NATO, and collective defense would provide NATO, that's no doubt on that. But, and Mr. Sørensen hinted on that and indicated, we should have hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. The United States will have an election. We cannot anticipate the final result, the winner of the election, but we cannot preclude that someone will take over the most important position of the free world, the presidency of the United States, who can consider again, as someone did it, the security as an interchangeable commodity and to put on sale our security, as he did it in the case with Kurds. Maybe you remember a few years ago, he betrayed the closest allied in Middle East, and so on. Therefore, we have to prepare for that and to strengthen our security and defense and everything in the worst case. Hopefully, it won't come. But as you know, there's a Latin proverb, si vis pacem para bellum. If you wish or want peace, you should prepare for the war. And that's my final.
Thank you very much. And I think this is where we should start our discussion. Is Europe prepared to fight a war of attrition against anyone, against Russia, against any adversary? Looking at our societies, looking at polling, if you ask societies, are they willing to die for their own countries, you will find percentage of 20 in Spain, Portugal, maybe 30 in France, and even here in Poland, only 48% of Poles say they are willing to die for their country. So how do we prepare for the worst? And also, I think we all agree with the analysis that the challenge is overwhelming. But here in Central and Eastern Europe, we understand, and the war in Ukraine has proven that without the United States, there is no security. The United States and the UK, to some extent, were probably the most robust, have shown the most robust answer and have been the quickest to assess Ukraine. And many countries, without naming and blaming, have dragged their feet for a very long time, too long from the perspective of the war. So how do you see, us as Europeans able to protect and defend the European continent if there's not the mindset to do that, and also the technical, logistical capabilities at this point to do it without the Americans? Gerlinde, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can do that once I get my mic going. Yes. Look, I think the agreement, if you wish, the labor division between NATO and the EU is that NATO will continue to be the anchor of collective defense and security. So the hard power, if you wish. Yeah. But having said that, at the same time, we wish to see NATO Europe, or the European pillar in NATO, acquire more capability of its own, because arguably currently they don't have it. They are lacking, as Europeans, we are lacking capabilities for strategic lift. Bringing people out of a crisis scenario, case of Afghanistan, or case of Libya, we are lacking strategic enablers such as communications. So we are lacking capabilities. All this is the consequence of several decades of cashing the peace dividend. Yeah. So we need to, as Europeans, and I'm a convinced European, in addition to being a convinced transatlanticist, as Europeans, we have to invest more in defense. Yeah, but we also, and perhaps that is even more important, we need the political will and the leadership to actually say we want Europe to become increasingly also a geostrategic actor. If there is the will, there is a way. But we have to muster this will amongst our populations, amongst the people we are electing, amongst the people we are then having in Europe representing ourselves. So currently, Europe could not defend itself. 80% of defense investment comes from non-EU allies. 80%. So, you can do something with 20%, but not that much.
Thank you. Professor, using your analogy, if we have an imperialistic mindset, are we willing and able to fight for the ideas of the empire?
Well, I don't think we are going to war in the immediate future. Russia, which you all see as a major opponent, is losing a war against Ukraine, for God's sake. It's a weak state with a much weaker military than we thought. And it is true, we must have closer European cooperation. NATO must as far as I can see, be expanded in the longer run, and we must stand together. But I must also ask you, how much superiority is enough? Because we already have it. We already have superiority in the West. Russia is not an impressive opponent for the time being. China might be, but this then leads to the thinking that if we can keep drawing in China in the economic circuits, because they need that, then we will have an easier game. And I'm not sure I agree that we should spend all that extra money on the military right now.
Here we have the first disagreement, that's clear.
I think we disagree here.
István, should we invest in military? I think you made the point that we should.
Exactly. I challenge Mr. Professor position. I think we should. And we are not really safe. Europe, we don't have any shield against the missiles. Neither here nor in Hungary, nor at least in the Central and Eastern Europe. We are very vulnerable, and we should strengthen our military capabilities. And now the war in Ukraine is a good laboratory. We know where we are strong and where we are weak. We know exactly that our drones and our HIMARS and GDAMs and so on can be jammed. The Russian is able to jam it. Therefore, we have to update our military technology, because we would like the war, not. But the deterrence is the major guarantee against the war. If we are so strong that we have a strong deterrence, then won't be any war. If we cannot really deter, and they suppose that they can hit us and they can hurt us, then they will do that. And I would like to warn you, for everyone or us, to think that's the rationality and the criteria, the rationality that we use, it's applicable and applied on Russian. They have very different criteria for rationality. They are rational, but for a very different criteria. That means that for them, the losses, the human losses and so on, doesn't matter so much as in Europe. So we are very sensitive for that, for the losses. We see that Russia is not sensitive at all, and so they are going further up in the war. I think so that we have to up, and there is a consensus. As far as the general mood in Europe concerned, I think it's going to change. And even in that sense, the war and the aggression against Ukraine, it helped. It helped, and many Europeans started to understand that we are living in a dangerous world. Of course, that was an overall optimism in the 90s, and the peace dividend and everything, that's the end of history. Now there won't be any full-scale war and anything else in the world. But now we see that's possible. A full-scale war in Europe, in your neighborhood, in our neighborhood, in Hungary, it's possible. And there is another world power which is seeking to undermine the security of the world and the global security. That's China. That's also there. Therefore, I think we have to prepare.
Thank you very much. We have 15 minutes left for questions. Do we have any first questions? First question here, anybody else? And the second here. So we'll take two, and if we find a time for another round, and three. Yeah, so let's take three, and there will be only one round. Could I ask somebody to pass on the mic? First to the gentleman here with... yeah, I will not give my mic. Please do introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Cesare. I guess I should introduce myself as an entrepreneur. And my question will go directly to Ms. Gerlinde Niehus. So I came across data which says that in terms of the budget for military expenditures, some years ago, USA was actually more powerful or spent more money than next 14 countries that follow. And as for now, it turns out that actually it is just larger or more than the second in line, which is China. So my question will be, what will be the long-term roadmap for NATO to make sure that US and its allies will become still the most important power, not China?
Thank you very much. Then the gentleman here, if you can pass on the mic, 5 individuals further.
Hi, I'm Pavel. I'm generally a liberal activist, I would say. My question is, in the context of what you have all said, is the European army, is the European federalism an optimal solution somehow to the issues you have mentioned? That's all.
Interesting, the question of European army. Thanks. And one more, if you can pass it to the back.
Just to add, in the context, of course, also of what President Macron also is proposing. That's all.
So the European strategic autonomy, in sense, going alone without Americans. Yes, please.
Yes, good evening, Marcin Olender. This is just a follow-up to this one, but a lot of the things you mentioned, I've heard also in the previous panel today with Ms. Applebaum, the spectre of President Trump returning and pulling out of Europe or even pulling out of NATO, which, you know, is arguably possible, but are we doing, and I think this has kind of been answered, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on how can we maybe avoid this acting in a more responsible way in Europe? Because if I remember correctly, the biggest gripe President Trump had with the European allies is that they were not spending enough and they were free riding. And to be honest, I think that he's got a pretty good argument there. I mean, why should a rich economy like Germany be spending so little on defense and basically, as you said, as the gentleman just mentioned, free riding basically on American taxpayers? I think that is a very valid argument, and the question is, like, can we be more loyal allies and hence sort of preempt this move potentially that we're, I think, all afraid of? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So maybe to structure the questions a bit, I think we need to answer the question, the most important question. And do you think it's realistic that actually under Donald Trump, the United States would move out of NATO, retreat of NATO, and only then could we start thinking about a European army? If we can frame it, you know, to really, for the audience to understand, do you consider this a realistic scenario? And does that mean the end of NATO?
Look, I don't have a crystal ball here, so I don't know whether Mr. Trump will win the next election. I don't even know whether he will be the candidate running for it. So all this is a bit in the realm of speculation. What I can say is this: it's not only since Trump. It goes back to many earlier presidents that the U.S. has consistently made the point. Sometimes in more stronger terms, sometimes in more diplomatic terms, but the bottom line was always they wanted NATO Europe to invest more in defense. So, and that is what we need to do, yeah? And talking about strategic autonomy or strategic responsibility is fine, but as long as it doesn't translate into concrete actions, it is just lip service. So you need to, as I said before, you need to put the money where your mouth is, yeah? And incidentally, there is, at least according to our opinion polls, which we are conducting across NATO nations, there are some roughly 70% of our populations, 70, who agree to either maintaining or even increasing investment in defense. So it's not as if we would be working against the public opinion there. Yeah, but then in perspective, we also, and one of the reasons why the Americans are also so much pushing and underscoring the need for more Europe in defense is that they themselves, you have to bear in mind, they are an Atlantic country, power, but they're also equally a Pacific power. So they have interest on both sides of their country, and they don't have the luxury to choose. So they see that the rising China, and a China which has the strategic ambition to become a competitor on the level of the US and NATO together. So that is the goal they are working towards strategically, patiently, but that is what they are doing. So from here 20 years, that's probably where they're going to be. So we need to get ready for that China, not today's China, the China we're going to see in 20 years, which will be a peer competitor to the US and NATO together. So So, and also against this context, the US is saying Europe needs to do more. You need to develop more of your capabilities. You need to have more of your own assets so that you can look more after your security. Ideally, also be more in the forefront of containing Russia, because currently, again, we are depending to a large degree on Russia when it comes to containing Russia. Yeah. So then just one large word on the European army. I know this is a kind of fancy term. Honestly, I don't know what a European army is. I don't see any clear definition of this concept. Would this entail that nations would delegate the decision about where to send the army, probably into harm's way, because in a war, people die, as we can see these days? Would nations delegate that responsibility to a supranational body such as the EU? I don't see this happening. I mean, I would always think that nations want to retain the responsibility of sending their people in harm's way to themselves. So what is a European army then any different from the armies we already have? And by the by, nations only have one set of forces, and they can choose to use them under NATO or under the EU. So in that sense, it doesn't change anything. So I think, in many ways, this is a concept which doesn't help us that much.
Thank you very much. Professor, please, the question of European army and the question of, us delivering.
I'm not sure I can add too much to that. I think that I would agree on the issue that, we have to have deterrence, we have to have stand up, we have to some extent been free riders. But I think I'm worried about the whole framework for this discussion, because I don't think that Mr. Putin and his comrades are spending the nights thinking about how they can attack NATO. I think they have their hands full already. I think you simply overestimate the Russian threat against us. And I think to some extent the same with China, I'm sorry to add. Until recently at least, China spent more on domestic security than international security. They spent more on controlling their own population than they did on creating a strong army. I think that what Europe needs to think about is as much creating strong societies than as creating strong armies. And that includes facing climate issues and migration issues and economic inequality issues and a host of other things. And we cannot forget that in the discussion of the military. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I think this is a very good moment to bring in Dr. Jacek Bartosiak. There were some really broken hearts out there where they didn't see you at the beginning, Jacek, so I'm happy you've made it. Welcome to Łódź. Let me maybe start with exactly where we finished here. Do you think we're overestimating the Chinese and Russian threat?
My apologies for being late. Major traffic issues. And thank you for inviting me over to this panel. Actually, it depends who says what, because some people overestimate, some people underestimate. I think that we are on the path to the major showdown in the Western Pacific if nothing changes in the United States and China. Things may change either in China or in the United States in terms of the structural forces that trigger events, trigger political decisions. I mean, the technology war, trade war, domestic situation in China. But as of now, we are on a path to a major confrontation and showdown, resulting from misperception and the incidental spiraling escalation, given the structural forces behind those two powers. And in the United States, I think there is already understanding that this might be happening very soon, as opposed to Europe, which is in limbo in that respect.
What does that mean to us, to Europe?
So there is a major discrepancy between how the Americans are viewing it, and the American military is viewing it, and the European, the so to speak, environment or strategic circles. And I think that stems also from the quite natural phenomenon that Europe is in a different strategic situation than the United States. It has different interests than the United States. So the underpinning question that we need to ask ourselves as Europeans, who we are and who we want to be in, let's say, 25, 30 years. Whether we are part of the North Atlantic community of nations. That is quite a new concept after 1945, by the way. Or we are a separate entity, separate geopolitical pole, whether we call it EU, whether we call it Federation of European States, whatever we call it, and we need to make this decision. And this is the most fundamental question. Since the, being a Pole, I can't say we have overestimated Russia. Basically, what Russia did was not an attack against Europe, it was a strike against credibility of the United States and the United States' position in Europe as a European power. And it was the objective of demonstrating that the United States doesn't have credibility and is not a European power and cannot guarantee security architecture. So that's why Russia must be a pillar of the security architecture. And let's welcome Germany and France to join this nice project from Vladivostok to Lisbon. And that would underpin, and that would be an underlying force behind the, closer cooperation between Russia and the continental Europeans. And of course, on the way to achieve that, we need to trample the intermarium countries, the countries, those small or middle countries of Central Eastern Europe. And the war is about their destiny, about our destiny. And it's not decided yet. It's not certain that Russia is going to lose this war. So it's just the beginning of this, I think, 15 years of the chaos. And of course, I have not answered your question whether we have the future as a Europe, because this is that's the last sentence, that's one of the most difficult questions. And I have no answer to that, actually. I see so many problems in achieving unity, in understanding that we have, what kind of threats we have, for example, whether Russia is a threat or a neighbor, whether Africa is a threat or a neighbor. There is no unity in Europe. And without unity, we will not have the future, common future.
István, are you also as pessimistic about Europe? And what I'll try to do, because we have 12 minutes and we've decided actually to continue in this panel, I'll give you a chance to ask one more round of questions after this. So, István, please.
I'm not pessimistic.
I know you're not. That's why I'm asking you.
I would like to wake up the European public opinion, and I hope so very much that Europe can meet the challenges ahead of us, and I'm firmly confident. As far as the question concerned, whether United States can move out or step out from NATO, my answer would be, formally, I cannot imagine that. I don't think so that's realistic. But it's realistic that they can evaporate the cohesion of NATO. It's like Mr. Trump said, it's an obsolete organization. The Article 5 is not always valid, and so on. And then could undermine the significance of NATO. That could happen. That's the danger, not that they formally step out. And as far as the European army concerned, fully agree with you. The problem is now that if we don't have a clear rules of deployment and of the army, it doesn't make any sense. That's the same as it we have now. And we need the clear command and and the decision-making procedure on how can we apply and deploy the army. Otherwise, doesn't make anything.
Thank you. So, last round of questions. It does not surprise me. Please, number 1, number 2, and I have another. Only gentlemen. I'm so sad to see that, but. Do I need a mic? Yes, you do. But okay. Przemek, if you have the mic, please ask.
Kamil Dosiak.
Kamil, I'm sorry.
Professor Szent-Iványi, because you were talking about reality and realism, that EU has to be more realistic than idealistic. So the question what we have is, what should be the position of European Union towards Hungary, towards behavior of Viktor Orban in this situation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. First question. The next one, please.
Piotr Napierała. Okay, so my question is about all those theories that there is some huge conflict, so to speak, between Germany and France on one hand, on one side, and the Anglo-Saxon powers, so to speak, on the other side. Because it's very popular theory, and well, I think that at least one of the panelists is proponing this idea that there is a huge gap and huge
basically our societies and democracy. Do you perceive that as a threat? And how do we counter? What are our counter strategies that we use at the same time not using the same tools that Russia uses, autocratic tools?
Yeah. Well, I can only speak for the NATO's currently 31 nations, and they all do agree that Russia is currently our single most existential threat to security of the Euro-Atlantic area. So that is, as I mentioned, enshrined in our leading strategic document, the new strategic concept. So and that was agreed between all these nations. So I think that is a very strong political stance, and it has a reason, because Russia is fighting this open war in Ukraine, but at the same time, of course, also sowing discord in amongst our societies, supporting parties on the fringes of the electoral spectrum, be it on the left or the right, trying to sow diversion with separatist groups in various countries, trying to use our vulnerabilities, economic dependencies. Yes, we have made ourselves more independent from Russian oil and gas, but there are other dependencies which still exist. And Russia, of course, also means of circumventing the the sanctions. So there is this hybrid war of Russia which is being waged against us, cyber attacks against key strategic infrastructure, etc., etc. I could go on. So clearly, but all this together, I mean, NATO is and remains a defensive organization. So we are not starting to wage cyber war against Russia. But what we have done, if you wish, as a strategic orientation, we have moved away from a concept of deterrence by punishment to what is called deterrence by denial. So deterrence by punishment means that you punish somebody when he has entered your house. Then you sort of grab him and kind of throw him out again. Yeah? Deterrence by denial means that you don't let him in the first place. So and that is the concept towards which our defense posture is now posed. So it's a shift in the deterrence posture. But then to this question of diversion between France, Germany, and others. Well, I can only say NATO operates by consensus, and this goes for everything. I mean, be this a strategic concept, be this the decision about the investment in defense by 2%, be this the Defense Procurement Act, etc., etc. So yes, nations have different interests. I would say this is legitimate, but at the end of the day, we always find a compromise which works for all of us. So I would not artificially create these divisions, because in essence we do know that if we stick together, we are better off together.
Thank you, Professor. We unfortunately have a few minutes left. Yeah.
I just want to agree with you that I'm not trying to say that Russia is not to be reckoned with. I'm not trying to say that misperception can lead us into disaster, because that's always been a possibility, and maybe it will be a more significant possibility in the future. What I'm trying to say is that the threats that you talk about in terms of hybrid war is something that I think also can be faced strongly by creating stronger societies. If there were less of right-wing radical movements to be hooked up with by the Russians, we would not be so vulnerable. So the issue is not only about producing guns. It's about producing stronger and more resistant societies. And we just have. You're right about Hungary. We just have to remember that Mr. Orban is elected by the people. He's supported by a nice number of people, as Michael Ignatieff said yesterday evening. So, and I think that's something we have to think about. Who would have thought that currently Germany is becoming the weak man of Europe? But that's for another discussion.
Thank you. And last, Jacek, how would you summarize?
Okay. In terms of Europe, I think that the future of Europe is in the unknown. And this is not a trifle observation. Europe has found itself recently in a labyrinth of decisions to be made. Who we are, whether we go along with the United States in anti-China decoupling policy, which will kill the German industry, whether we confront Russia in a full deterrence by denial posture, which, by the way, has not happened yet. It's just talk. That deterrence, because deterrence denial is a very risky proposition for the Western European soldiers and American soldiers, and they don't want to do it in the Baltic states. And that's why the Balts are not happy with the NATO consensus, by the way, speaking of the cohesion. And that's why also the Russians sort of, thought that they had an upper hand vis-a-vis Ukraine. So NATO underperformed in terms of the deterrence in the East since, Warsaw Summit and later. So there are many even detailed questions and issues, as I have mentioned right now. And it's so difficult to bridge all the gaps in understanding the situation between Poles and Germans and French. There are different concepts. I don't know how we're going to come to the conclusion as Europeans, given the fact that the American cloud is heavier and heavier on Europe. And some people like it, some people don't like it. Poles like it, yeah? But I'm not sure if all Western Europeans like it, for many, many reasons, including the breakup of the social contract, if America compels Europeans to decouple from China.
Thank you very much. Czas minął, time is up, as I'm informed, and I am sure our panelists, especially this one who came late, will be very happy to answer your individual questions, but all of the panelists are here around, so please feel free to come up to them to discuss in a more informal context. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you for excellent questions, and we wish you a wonderful evening.
Jestem z zawodu lekarzem, zajmowałam się diagnostyką chorób nowotworowych.
W Białorusi zajmowałam się mikrobiologią i molekularną biologią.
Byłem nauczycielem szkoły podstawowej.
Naszym celem jest budowanie umiejętności, które są ważne na polskim rynku pracy.
Szybko nabierają takiej pewności siebie, bardzo szybko się uczą.
Wszystko możliwe, kiedy starasz się.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it. And how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Ihrer Ausreise.
Dzień dobry. To znaczy, myśmy się dzisiaj widzieli. Wie pan co? Ja zmieniłem zdanie i chciałbym poprawić. Karty. W urnie. Dobrze? To ja sobie poszukam.
Serio? Pan sobie poszuka? Nadchodzące wybory są zbyt ważne, by zostawić je bez kontroli. Dołącz do obywatelskiej kontroli wyborów. Zróbmy wybory bez piecu.
Każdy wybór ma swoje konsekwencje.
Dziś na kazaniu o takich jak ty mówili, że to morderczynie.
A wiesz, że ta, która ci pomogła, trafi za kraty?
Trzeba mieć sumienie.
Jak mogłaś to zrobić własnej matce?
Aborcja to najgorsza zbrodnia.
Gdybym ja podjęła taką decyzję, nie byłoby cię tutaj.
Organy państwa nie będą przyglądać się temu obojętnie.
Życie i zdrowie kobiety jest najważniejsze.
Stop kryminalizacji aborcji.
Kobieta decyduje.